So the next topic is WVRAM and mitigation.
In terms of the assessment, I understand that it's developed for reproducibility, and everybody could use it and theoretically get the same score. But how much would a change of opinion and interpretation of some of these questions affect the overall score? Like the deviation between even just the difference of your understanding of the microtopography of the site or something like that. What difference between these check boxes, and this might be something that's explained in the manual in detail, and I can read it later, but
oh no, ask. It's so much easier to ask me than to find it in the manual.
I'm trying to figure out like how broadly those differences in opinion impact the overall score.
Yeah.
Is that, I know that's something that's been factored into it, and just trying to understand trying to make sure that when we look at these and review these and see somebody else's opinion, and maybe for some reason or another we might not trust their opinion or outlook on their interpretation of answering these, what kind of impacts would those deviations in answers have on the overall score, and understanding that obviously some of these are going to have a bigger impact in how it's interpreted, but maybe the smaller facts?
Yes.
How does that impact the score exactly?
That's a wonderful question. So when we talk about repeatability, we're not talking about getting exactly the same score. We're talking about scores coming back within 10% of one another. And as an example, at our last user training, where we had, I think, 23 people all going out doing their own assessment, these were obviously experienced wetland delineators, because that's a prerequisite for the user course. They'd had the one day of training when they went out like you guys did, and they came back and then did their own. They didn't have any help with it. They had to do all their own mapping, their own soils, their own everything. And they did come back within 10% of one another, and we were sort of looking at these results coming in thinking, whew, like this is what we aim for. It seems to be what we're getting. Is our goal is to be within 10%. Now, if you have people deliberately lowballing or highballing a score, you're not going to get that. But if you have folks who are diligently trying to do a good job, these small differences in judgment on certain metrics shouldn't come out to more than a 10% difference. That said, there are some metrics that make a big difference, and I'm really going to encourage you to download the restoration supplement, which is designed to help our mitigation people maximize their WVRAM score in an ethical way by actually doing great restoration. And so we do actually have a chart on page 28 of this that has the specific point breakdown for every metric in the regulatory score and exactly how much that metric is worth, what's your maximum score that you can get on that metric. We also have a list, which I'll show you in a few minutes, of the metrics that are a function of location that really, no matter what you do, you're not going to change that metric. You either are in a good neighborhood or you're not. And so for mitigation bankers, you want to site your bank in a good neighborhood to take advantage of all those metrics that you can't change, that are a function of where you're geographically located in the state. But yes, that is an excellent question, and one that we debated the advantages of being fully transparent about this, and we decided in the end it's really better to put all the information out there and let people see exactly what each metric is worth and how you could get to the next threshold. And that might mean that you add exactly 3% coarse woody debris to your wetland in order to get into that category of the next higher metric. But at least people would then be doing that. So we've tried to be transparent about it. And
this is super helpful too. I think it's in that supplement.
Oh yes, in the supplement too, yeah.
Every checkbox,
yeah,
exactly what score it goes to. Okay.
Yeah.
So that way you can say, these 5 checkboxes go to this, or this one goes to this
right.
one.
So yeah, this has the names of the variable names for each part of the field sheet. And so you can connect that up to that final score sheet that listed all those different scores. here with all, these are all the different variables and how they're scored, and so you can match up your field sheet to those scores there. And then you could also match it to that list of what it comes out to on the regulatory score. These are raw points, and they get, it's actually a fairly simple transformation. They get divided by 85 to come up with the regulatory component. And that's because we originally designed it to be a 0 to 100 scale, but then the Corps requested that we remove some metrics, and so we were down to 0 to 85. So those metrics went into other scores, but not the regulatory score. So we're going to talk a little bit about how WVRAM interfaces with mitigation. And this is, we probably don't need to say this because we've already been through much of it, but just as reassurance, because change is always scary, and it's always like, how am I going to deal with all of the hassles of adopting this new method? If it's any comfort, we have been using it for 6 years now at DEP, and the kinks have been pretty much worked out. We don't expect to have a lot of changes in the method in the immediate future. And DEP is investing in WVRAM. We have currently 1.5 permanent civil service positions that deal with wetlands specifically. Also, we're working on cross-training additional personnel at DEP. It's been through public notice at DEP. It's been positively peer-reviewed by our partners and experts, and it's designed for regulatory use, and it has co-evolved with the SWVM. So we've been tweaking WVRAM and working on it at the same time we've been revising the SWVM, so they should work together fairly seamlessly. That said, there are limitations and constraints to WVRAM, and it's good to just keep these in mind. This is kind of ridiculously small, so I'll just tell you what they are. It does not change any current procedures for delineating wetlands. Those do not change at all with WVRAM. It doesn't impact jurisdictional status in any way. It's just an assessment method. It doesn't evaluate all possible functions. There's a lot of different functions. I know out in Oregon, I think they have, it's something like 100 different functions that they specifically evaluate. We don't. We have those big composite functions that we determined were important for West Virginia: habitat and ecological integrity, water quality, benefits, and the stabilization of hydrology. That would be diminishing peak flows of floods, providing base flow to streams, and dealing with drought. It's not intended to address the very important question of whether or not a site is located, a restoration site is located in a geomorphically appropriate area. Is the site on hydric soils? WVRAM does not address that question. That's a separate question. You have to do good site location, and then WVRAM may tell you if you do a good site location, your WVRAM score will be higher. But WVRAM doesn't tell you up front which site has hydric soils on it. That would be the hydric soils map. Or which site has good hydrology. That's a separate question. Okay, and it doesn't replace detailed performance criteria for mitigation sites. WVRAM is a blunt tool. It's a rapid assessment tool. It's not a detailed tool to measure change over time. However, it's definitely going to be part of performance criteria that will give you your ballpark. Is the wetland on a good trajectory toward success, combined with other metrics? And also, it doesn't directly measure the wetland functions. That would take months of installation of having piezometers and just all kinds of instrumentation out on a wetland. It is an approximation using well-accepted proxies for those functions. So those are the caveats with WVRAM. There are two things that are different about scoring for credits versus scoring for debits or impacts. We talked about these briefly yesterday. One is the assessment area. When you're doing a mitigation project, the assessment area is the project area. It's not the entire wetland unit, although much of the time the project area on a restoration site is the wetland unit. But there will be cases where you're adjacent to an existing wetland, and in that case we ask that you do a baseline of the whole wetland unit at the beginning of the restoration project and another WVRAM of the whole thing at the end of the project at your 10-year monitoring release to be sure you haven't degraded that existing wetland that you're contiguous to. And we can look at an example of that in just a minute. Then the fact that the GIS-derived site biodiversity rank is not part of the credit score. So you don't get credit for rare species just because their home range happens to overlap your wetland and they may be present in an adjacent wetland. You don't get that GIS-based site biodiversity rank on your restoration site. However, if you have rare species move into your restored wetland because you've done a fabulous job of creating appropriate habitat, and the Natural Heritage Program comes out, documents it, accepts it, which they're not going to do for a one-time occurrence. They're going to want to see that it's a stable population. But that could possibly happen over 5 or 10 years that they would credit that, and then you would get those. There is a path to getting credits for rare species, but it has to be accepted into the Natural Heritage database. Okay, so what are realistic targets for a wetland mitigation site? And I'm sure that people will try to propose a 1.0 because that's the maximum score you can get without rare species. But in fact, we've made a big effort over the last few years to sample existing restoration sites that are between 1 year old up to 35 years old and look at what the WVRAM scores of actual sites are. And it seems like within the 10-year monitoring period, the very best of the best, the projects that really were sited well, executed well, designed well, are scoring between 0.6 or 6. That should be 0.6 and 0.66. Sorry for the decimal wrong there, but between a 0.6 and a 0.66. That is a realistic target for a well-designed, well-executed project. You can see there's lots of projects scoring between 0.5 and 0.6, and also quite a few scoring between 0.4 and 0.5. There's plenty of people doing less well than that. But if someone is submitting a plan to you and saying, we're going to create a 0.75 wetland, it probably won't pass the red face test. That you're going to need to say, prove it to me. After you've built one that scores that high, maybe we'll look at our realistic targets. And when we talk to our users, we challenge them. We say, look, this is what you've been able to do so far. Do better. And then you can ask for more credits. But at this point, that is a realistic ask. Any questions on that?
Is there a difference between forested and non-forested?
There is. Obviously, the more woody vegetation you get, the higher you're going to score. And I think all of those high-scoring ones were aiming for forested. But they hadn't all gotten there when we did the WVRAM. Some of them, I would say most of those were shrub swamps after 10 years. PSS, because it's hard to get a forest back in just 10 years. So yeah, most of those were shrub swamps, but they were aiming, for the most part, aiming for forested. Then for enhancement, where you've got an existing wetland and you're going to improve some of the functions of that, we have much less data for that, but it seems like 0.15 to 0.25 is a realistic lift. Again, for a well-designed, well-executed project. We have some that are less high than that, but there's actually one example that's higher, 0.27, which is the Barton Bench project done up on the Mauer Tract by the U.S. Forest Service. They've poured enormous resources into doing that. It was very expensive. It wouldn't work on a profit model at all. But they have done a really good job of taking that strip mine and restoring wetlands that were initially just containment ponds that are now relatively high functioning wetlands. But that, again, that was kind of an extraordinary effort. So probably around 0.2 is what you're going to expect with a well-designed enhancement project. Looking at the scores, we also have, thanks to Sarah and Kylie and others who have been diligently out sampling random wetlands across the state, everything from the worst of the worst up to, you know, cranberry glades and the beautiful places. We have now a good random sample with about maybe 200 sites statewide that are truly randomly selected. So we're starting to get a picture for status and trends. And so the random is the orange line here. They go from really awful, I don't know, 0.25 score, up to really nice, a 0.95. And this is excluding the exemplary wetlands, of which there have also been a couple that have gotten into our random sample that we had a lot of fun going out and sampling. But excluding those exemplary ones, 0.25 to 0.95 for the randoms. The restored sites start out higher. We have now close to 50 samples from restored sites. They start out higher at about 0.35, but they only get up to that, the very best of them, and that's after, I think, 35 years, gets up to a 0.72. So it tells us what we already know, which is that it's hard to replace Mother Nature. It's better to avoid these wetland impacts because it's very, very hard to put them back. Even the best sites, after a long time, still are not approaching what we would get just from a random sample. It's interesting that the median scores for the randoms are higher than the median scores for the restored sites. It tells us we can do a lot better with restoration. Part of what it tells us, I think, is that we've been, for the last 5 years or so, rewarding people for building emergent wetlands as opposed to incentivizing them to build forested wetlands. And hopefully WVWRAM will shift that incentive toward putting back forested wetlands, which are the common wetland type we would expect in West Virginia. And that restored curve will begin to approach the upper levels of at least the random curve. You'd like to see it be better than random, because the random curve includes some really heavily impacted wetlands as well. It includes private land as well as public land. So let's look at a case study, and possibly more than one case study. We'll see how things go. But this is an in-lieu fee site, an actual site in Randolph County that was a headwater wetland restoration. And in 2016, it was basically lacking in hydrology and vegetation. There wasn't a wetland there, so reestablishment. And in 2018, this is one of the highly successful sites, it scored a 0.66. So we're looking at the best of the best, a really nice effort here. The actions that were taken were that excavated depressions showed development of hydric soils. There was a palustrid scrub shrub dominated by meadowsweet and silky willow. There was 1% invasive reed canary grass, but mostly native vegetation at this site. So how would you get to a score like that? How would you plan it? And you can run scenarios. You remember from yesterday how you can do scenario planning with the GIS? And here are 4 scenarios that could have been considered at this site and how they would score. So when the folks are planning, they can actually run a GIS score on the area they're going to map, fill out the field assessment as though they had completed their post-construction, do it all hypothetical, and come up with a target score. And that, I think, is what you want to see your people doing when they submit applications. So if you just added microtopography and depressions, planted native shrubs, and treated invasives, you could get to a score of 0.59. If you then connected to the floodplain and planted native shrubs and treated invasives, but you didn't do the microtopography and depressions, you could get a score of 0.62. If you did the floodplain, the microtopography, the shrubs, and invasives, you could get to a 0.66, which is where they did get to. If on top of that, you planted red spruce trees, which would be the appropriate wetland tree to plant in this particular habitat, could have gotten to a 0.73, maybe not in 2 years, but possibly in 10 years. And you would be on a little different trajectory if you had also planted the foundation wetland tree of red spruce at that site. So in year 2, this WVRAM was conducted with a score of 0.66. There was 0.65 acres, and they had excavated the wetland to bring it to bankful elevation and excavated depressions, added microtopography, planted native shrubs, and treated invasives. And that gave them a very high score. They did a good job of it, but it's also a really nice neighborhood that they're working in, a place that just really wanted to be restored. So if we look at which metrics changed immediately, just post-construction, year 1, you've constructed it, you've already got a significant change in a bunch of metrics. You've connected your wetland to the river continuum, so those connection boxes have been checked and the disconnection boxes are now gone. You've created some depressions that hold water and attenuate the flood peaks, and in all these cases they're getting 100% of the maximum score post-construction, so right away. Creating microtopography, again, right away you can get 100% of that total score. Adding structural patches, this was a place these folks really missed out on low-hanging fruit. They only got 34% of the maximum score, and they could have added some more coarse woody debris, and they could have added some stuff and gotten a higher score here with those structural patches. Some structural patches, if they do a good job, are going to develop naturally, and so that score may go up. The portion of the wetland in the floodplain, they got 100% of that metric immediately post-construction. Removing hydrologic stressors, they did not get all of that score, but they got a good chunk of it. Adding available surface water, so again, those would be up to 10% of the site could be in open water, and that would provide some credit. Once you get over 10% of the site, it's going to start detracting from your score. Seasonal ponding and saturation, so they did manage to create a wetland that is seasonally saturated as opposed to just an open pond or something. So that's good. They got all the points for that post-construction. Lack of soil stressors, 50%. That over time will change as the wetland soils develop at the site, and that will get better. Planting natives and treating invasives, they only got 10% of the total potential there, and that's a place where, again, if they planted some foundation trees, the red spruce, no reason not to plant them because deer don't even eat them. So if you're in red spruce territory, there's just no reason not to plant red spruce. They could have gotten a lot more score there. And planting woody vegetation, in this case shrubs, they got part of the score for that. So which metrics may continue to change over time? That was year 2, or that was post-construction, and then year 2. And so as you go on through time, what might continue to change as you get toward credit release? And things that typically continue to change would be floristic qualities should be getting better and better over time. So post-construction, it was 0.012. By year 2, it was up to 0.059, but the maximum is 0.129, so there's another bunch of points you could get there. Persistent ungrazed vegetation was also not maxed out. There's more room for that metric to grow. And woody vegetation, lots more room for that metric to grow as well. If the site trajectory is good, we would expect some additional metrics to change. Those include the development of multiple vegetation types. So if you leave vegetation alone on environmental gradients, it will sort itself out into different vegetation communities, like we saw the cattails and the wet meadow, that had sorted themselves out on a vegetation gradient. And so in almost any restoration project, you don't want to have just one uniform hydrology throughout the thing. You would like to have some interspersion of different types, and that's something that could continue to change over time. Right now at this site, there's only one vegetation type and one hydrology type, but that could well change over time. Development of vertical vegetation strata. As your woody vegetation grows, you may start to get different strata, and that could improve your score. Development of structural patches. Often over time, you'll get the development of things like vernal pools or little patches of tussocks and hummocks. Those things over time in a well-designed site should develop on their own. And the development of organic soils. So organic soil development can take place pretty quickly, although as I was mentioning to some of you, the normal rate of formation of peat is 1 millimeter every 10 years. It's really slow. But I have seen cases where in wetland restoration, where the site had been in a peat forming environment, and then it was turned into an agricultural field, it was trampled, the peat was all gone. And then when the hydrology was restored and the cattle removed, I've seen as much as 10 centimeters of peat form in 2 years. So if you're in a restoration context where the site is just perfect for organic soil formation, then that normal, very slow rate of formation in nature can be much accelerated. And so it is a very realistic target to see organic soils develop over that 10-year monitoring period. That is something a good wetland site should aim for. They get a lot of credit for it in WVWRAM, and there's no reason not to look, to aim for that. But you do have to get the hydrology right to do that. Then there's some metrics that are just a function of the good neighborhood that this site happened to be in. So it wasn't in a karst or limestone area. That's purely a function of location. But it was in a headwater location, so it got the maximum points for that right off. Post-construction, the first WVWRAM you do, as soon as it's a wetland, you get those points. Buffer condition and extent, it immediately had the maximum points because it was in a very nice, right in the middle of the Mon Forest. It was a little private inholding with forest all around it. The landscape or watershed scale, there's the biodiversity rank of the 12-digit HUC or watershed. It got the max points for that because it was already in a really nice watershed with a lot of wetland species in it that as soon as you restore the wetland, they're going to be there. They're going to come to that wetland because they're already close by. So a good neighborhood. It's also located in a DNR conservation focus area where DNR has specified certain parts of the state where they say wetlands are particularly important, and they have a conservation, they're working on management plans for those now. And it happened to be in a wetland breeding bird occupancy area with a lot of wetland breeding birds sitting around in nearby wetlands that will probably take immediate advantage of additional habitat. So that's, again, one of the GIS layers. You can't do anything about it. You're either in a block with breeding birds or you're not. And the watershed position that it was in, where it's in an area that has a lot of other wetlands nearby, so sort of the aquatic area abundance, where wetlands will then feed back and forth with each other, exchange species. Good neighborhoods, it's just easier to get points. And so this is one reason why I tell our users to just throw some dummy wetlands down on all the sites that you're thinking about taking an option on real estate for, and check your location metrics. Try to maximize those. If you have hydric soils and you're in a good neighborhood in terms of other metrics, you're going to actually get more credits out of your site than if you're working in a bad neighborhood. So there is, let's see, there's a bunch, again, in that restoration manual, there is a list of all the metrics that are a function of location. So again, in this restoration supplement, very worth downloading. Also, the user and the reference manuals are worth downloading. But there's a list of all those metrics, the hydrology metrics that are a function of location, impaired waters coming into or below your wetland, the buffer condition and extent, discharges, roads, railroads, landscape or watershed scale, that aquatic area abundance, biodiversity, land use disturbance, water quality issues or impaired waters, the mean slope, and watershed wetland size and uniqueness. So wetlands that are the only wetland in a watershed get ranked higher than, they get extra points for being, say, the largest wetland or the most important wetland within a watershed, that kind of thing. So yeah, just to mention those. Okay. So we've already looked at where the score goes on the SWVM. And I think what I'd like to do is do maybe one more example here, possibly two. This is an in-lieu fee site at Green Bottom and these are existing wetlands. This was the WVWRAM that was done prior to construction of the existing wetlands at the site. And then and you'll see the score, it has a B rank, it has state important biodiversity, it's a B5. The WVWRAM score is very high, 0.86, because of that B rank, which really pushes the score up. So this is our baseline on the contiguous wetlands before construction. Then construction was done, and the score of the entire wetland with the baseline has dropped to a 0.75, even though it still has that B rank. So what we actually are going to be monitoring over time at Green Bottom is the score just of the restoration area, which is only a 0.48. You can see how that pulled down the score of the whole wetland. But what they have done here is good. This wetland, the restored area, is not going to drain the high quality existing area. They've made it a little higher base level, so it can't drain that one. They're being very careful not to drain it. What we want to monitor and be careful of is, will invasive plants colonize here and move into the adjacent wetland? So working next to adjacent wetlands it's more complicated, and I think it's really good for applicants to realize, we stress this with our users, that if you're going to do this, you get some benefits of being adjacent to a wetland, but there are also some risks involved because you don't want to degrade the wetland that's already there. So you'd be monitoring this bit over time, and hopefully that score of 0.48 would go up to the point where the entire wetland score would go back to being a high quality wetland over time. That would be the ultimate success. So it's something to consider. There's another case study would be at the Morgan Tract, Lake Louise in Jefferson County. This was another case where this little wetland restoration project was done, and it's part of this very large wetland complex around the big spring on Turkey Run, also called Lake Louise. It's, I think, the largest limestone spring in the state. It's just amazing. And the wetland is a marl wetland, which means, unlike all other wetlands in West Virginia, its highest and best calling is to be an emergent wetland, not a forested one. There's a whole host of rare marl species that grow in emergent wetlands in Jefferson County, and the forested wetlands there are fairly humdrum. The emergent wetlands are spectacular. So this was a complicated project. The B rank here is a B4. It's getting up close to being an exemplary, but it's outstanding state biodiversity. The score of the entire wetland is a 0.88. This little area, it was an in-lieu fee project. It was quite an expensive one. What they did was scrape the agricultural overburden off the marl. So there was a hydric soil, the Fairplay soils, that are developed on marl, and they're like the slide I showed at the end of yesterday. They have the shell peat that looks like Rocky Road ice cream on them, and so they scraped the agricultural burden off those soils, which was quite expensive, and then planted. And the first year, I know, Brian, you pulled 3-seeded mercury and other things, just days worth of effort. The first year, it looked like a total failure. The second year, there were 2 rare marl specialist species that colonized the site. Last year, when Kylie and Sarah surveyed it, there were 5 rare marl specialist species that had colonized this site without being planted. They found the habitat from nearby marl wetlands, and this is an extremely rare wetland type. And those rare species don't occur anywhere else in this wetland complex. Most of this is forested. This whole section is reed canary grass. This is the one little restored section, but they came in from wetlands a couple of miles away and seeded themselves, and they found a way. It was just amazing. And now that's a site that we just look at and say, if we could do this, we've understood the importance of scraping off the agricultural overburden and exposing the original hydric soil, especially if it's a rare hydric soil. But it's very expensive. With all those rare species coming in, at this point, I think they're past credit release and all that.
Yeah, I think they're getting ready, if not already, you guys have closed that one.
Yeah, I don't know if you closed it out or not, but at this point, they could probably get a heritage botanist out there who would document those 5 rare species, and they could get a really high score off that wetland, because I think those species have moved in and are stable, have been there for several years now and been documented multiple times. So in year 8, that site had a WVRAM score of 0.58 without any B rank. But if you were to get a B rank with what we've seen, if natural heritage would confirm it, it would go up to a 0.79. Oh, and here's some of the species. Oh, yeah, so it's our native loosestrife. And that looks like maybe the Scutellaria. Is that what that one is? Yeah, and this is one of the juncus. These are both juncus. And the Scirpus, is that Torii? Or anyway, 2 juncus, a Scirpus, and the native loosestrife, and a mint.
That B rank comes out of, you said, the National Heritage.
Natural Heritage Database.
So
yeah.
when you would get ready to do a WVRAM analysis on something, you would sit down, you would do this precursory GIS search. It would come out then typically, like whether or not it has a B rank.
When you run the GIS tool, like on that final score report, it tells you if there's a B rank or not. Every time you run the GIS tool.
That I would check, and then it's not really evaluated past there. It's something that has to go through a.
Yeah, it's a static GIS layer that gets exported from the Natural Heritage Program to us that we hit with our GIS tool. So on that final score sheet, there's going to be a B rank box here, and in this case, for Ward Hollow, there's none in the GIS tool. But if you had a B rank, it would show up there. It would not be included in scoring for the restoration score, but it would be included in the impact score. But it will show up there, right at the top of the score sheet.
As long as it's something that I don't have to evaluate, that somebody else
You don't have to think about it at all.
Thank you.
It's all automated.
So I just know people will check it because they're like, of course, it's a old growth, whatever.
Oh yeah, well there are those few things you can check on the data sheet, the field observer, large bog or fen with its definition, old growth swamp or mature forested swamp. Or summit sinkhole. Those 4 things are the only things a field observer can check. And they should write a justification. If they're checking one of those, there should be something in the notes about it, how they knew that it was that. All the actual species, we had documented those, Sarah and Kylie and I, but they haven't been accepted in the heritage database yet, and so they don't count. It's got to be confirmed by heritage biologists,
Okay.
and then accepted into the database, and then sent back to us as a data dump, and it's a whole process. But it's all automatic. So yeah. No, we don't expect any of our surveyors or reviewers to figure out rare species. It's too complicated. That's DNR's job. Except that we do look for them because, we're out there. And we part of our permit from DNR asks us to submit every year what we have seen in terms of rare species, and they often do then confirm it, put it in their database. So, okay, so then let me see if there was anything else here to. Oh, here's a little site maybe would be worth taking a quick look at. The Hazelton WV site. Have any been out to that one? They made a nice little pond in the shape of West Virginia. Yeah.
I think Travis Home doesn't have that one.
I think that was a DOH site.
It is.
Yeah. And it's actually, it's not a bad site. It's got 1997 to 2016. So it's been 19 years here when we did the WVRAM assessment, got a score of 0.67. It's actually it's really not bad. Floodplain wetland complex with scrub, shrub, and emergent communities around a central pond. It has minimal invasives. Streams, it started out just these two ditches, and the stream is somewhat connected to that wetland now, and it's kind of surprising what you can do. These are some pictures of it. So 0.67, it's 11 years. Oh, this was 11 years post-construction, 4.6 acres. They excavated the West Virginia cell and did shrub plantings and stream restoration. And it's right there in between the highways, and it's full of pollinators. It's kind of cool. So.
Another one they tried to make look like a fish. But
Oh.
it was great.
I did not hear about the fish. That's really funny.
I don't think it was as successful as that.
Oh, yeah? Okay. And here's another little one that's been scored. I'm showing you all the best of the best here. These are like the successful ones. This is the Queens one that the Forest Service did. I don't know if any of you ever ran into Tom Biebighauser at the Forest Service in Ohio. Did you run into him? He was from Kentucky, but he moved around. He was just a passionate wetland restorer and did really nice creative things. And so this was Queens, and in 2005 it was just an old point bar on the Shavers Fork, and it wasn't wet. It had these had these really eroded channels going down through it, down to the Tiger, or to the, I guess it's, yeah, the Shavers Fork there. Super eroded, no wetlands at all. And by 2018, when I visited it, it had a WVRAM score of 0.65, and there was no channelized flow. All those eroded channels had just been sort of dumped onto the landscape, and he'd added a bunch of microtopography, so they made little depressions and ponds and wet meadows and shrub swamps, toe slope wetlands. He just moved all that water onto the land, slowed it down, and it just began to really flourish. There was no work after Tom Biebighauser came in with his bulldozers. So it's got 15% invasive plants on this site now. But the hydrology is pretty good, and who knows, maybe the trees are eventually going to grow up, shade them out, it might become nice. It is at any point, you can see all these little ponds and depressions, and it has a lot of water on it and a lot of species. It's a great place for amphibians. So they did a pretty good job there, and that was really just one-time construction, but done by someone who really knew what he was doing. And yeah, ditches removed, the flow was dispersed, dozens of small depressions added, and natives were planted. Those are some on-site pictures. It will probably eventually grow into a really nice forested wetland. Okay, do we have any more case studies that we feel like we should really look at? Maybe a quick look at the Tigert Mitigation Bank. Some of you may have been to this site near Elkins, near the DNR office. It's part of the Tigert River floodplain, and the Tigert's one of the few undammed rivers in our state, so it does flood. It has rather large floods. It was just a drained agricultural field. This is 2009. By 2011, you can see that the little wiggly channel the ditch has been turned into a wiggly channel. Lots of depressions added, this was already in an active floodplain. It's adjacent to, right over here is a very high quality oak swamp. So it's got tons of seed source and species feeding into it. And so it's doing pretty well with a score of 0.65, and that was how many years out? That was 8 years out that it had, 8 years post-construction on 14 acres, and it's looking really good. So we have more and more people who are able to do this well. There's no reason not to do it well, and it's kind of exciting to see the good stuff happening. And I think we can do even better. I'm very excited about the floodplain restoration work that's going on, where they restore the whole floodplain and let the river be not channelized, but become braided and have lots and lots of wetlands. And that maybe is enough to say about any other questions on mitigation? I mean, I could show you some of the horrible examples too, but I feel like everybody's seen horrible examples. Look at the good stuff. Yeah. But if people take this restoration supplement, and there's really detailed guidance in here of exactly, which metrics, which actions are associated with which metrics, where they occur on the data sheet, what they're worth. And so, if you want to increase your score, you've got to reconnect to the floodplain. You've got to create microtopography and depressions. You've got to plant native plants. And this is how it will be scored when you do that. So that is the point of that. Anyone questions? WVRAM for a restoration site's pretty much the same as doing WVRAM for an impact site. You're still assessing the site in the same way. There's only two differences between looking at a restoration site and looking at an impact site. One is that the rare species, the site biodiversity rank from the GIS, does not get applied to the restoration site, because if you're restoring a site, just because there's a rare species living right next to you doesn't mean you've created habitat for that it's going to be able to grow or live in your wetland. There is a path forward for people who want to get credit for rare species moving into their sites if they do a great job at creating habitat, if they can document it's there and get the Natural Heritage Program to accept that, and the Natural Heritage Program, they're going to be pretty reluctant to accept a single occurrence of a species. They're going to want to see it's been there for a few years and seems to be thriving and all of that. But say at your 5 or 10 year monitoring release, if the heritage people accept that you have a rare species that has colonized your wetland restoration, you would get that credit. But the GIS rank that gives you the rare species and communities doesn't get applied to the restoration score. That's just on the scoring side. In terms of the way we do the assessment, there's also a small difference. For impacts, we always try to do the entire wetland unit, but for restoration sites, you would do a baseline of the entire wetland unit, and then if you're restoring adjacent to that unit, you would do your monitoring, like your 1, 3, 5 year monitoring, just on the restored part. And so there'd be some loss in repeatability between sites for that. But in order to get the time series to be repeatable, we really have to just focus on the part that's being restored. And so there's a baseline of the whole wetland unit, individual monitoring of the place that's been restored, and then at the end of the whole project, another WVRAM of the entire unit to be sure you didn't go degrade. You know, you might have built something great here and drained a nice swamp because you made your water level too deep or something. So a baseline at the beginning and the end, and then time series on the restoration area itself. If the restoration area is not immediately abutting with a surface water connection or a direct groundwater connection to an existing wetland, then you're doing, you know, the restoration is your wetland unit and it's not an issue. So it's only when you're adjacent. But I know there's a temptation to work on public land adjacent to existing wetlands, and there's some risk involved in that because you might damage the adjacent wetlands. And so we're trying to avoid that happening.